Buju, Wago Shindagu, Migizi and Dodame, Minawa, Gaza Gasquaji Makog, and Dunjaba.
So we are here today for the next installment in YA Wednesdays. Hello, everyone. Everyone watching. This is we're talking about Anton Treuer's new book, Werewolves Don't Die. And Anton, just to get us started, I was hoping you could maybe tell the uninitiated something about what your book's about. Your little elevator
Oh,
pitch.
oh, sure. I'm really excited about this book, Where Wolves Don't Die. It is a young adult thriller, story of a 15-year-old native kid named Ezra Cloud, and he is kind of searching for clues to a murder, but finds himself in the process. It's a hybrid work. It is both a thriller and also a tender coming-of-age story. Um, I found myself honestly kind of frustrated with native lit in general until just a few decades ago. Most of it was authored by non-native people who hadn't even talked to one of us or spent time in one of our places. That's been changing dramatically over the past few decades. There's so much more great work being done by so many wonderful authors. But I still think a lot of it is focused on trauma and tragedy. And, I live here on the Leech Lake Reservation in northern Minnesota. We spend a lot of our time hunting, fishing, trapping, doing things like that. I speak my language, and most of the literature had native characters who lamented the culture they never had because of residential boarding schools and things like that. And I wanted to tell a story that had all of the gripping elements of a great narration, but that spoke to the living, beautiful culture we still have and wrestled with not just, colonization and trauma, but healing and reconciling and coming to terms, and so forth. And so that's kind of what I was embarking on with this particular work. Super excited about its initial reception, and
Us too.
forward to getting it in the hands of young people everywhere.
Well, that actually sort of partially answers my next question, but I was going to ask, I mean, those of us who are previous LQ readers might know you from your nonfiction book that you did with us, Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask, Young Readers Edition, which is still one of our bestsellers. And I'm curious what made you, because obviously you have a very extensive body of nonfiction work. What made you decide specifically to branch out into fiction and into young adult fiction as opposed to adult or like what was the, I mean, you've partially answered this, but what was the appeal?
You know, honestly, it was both personal and professional.
Yeah.
For starters, I have 9 children. We've got 6 out the door, 3 to go. And so over the past several years, both of my parents have passed away. I'm kind of become the family patriarch, so to speak. And I've been thinking a lot about how my life has been filled with young people and about the transition from, young person to adult, and also the roles of parents
Yep.
in that process. My life is also, in addition to being filled with young people, has been filled with elders. I've been officiating at ceremonies, using our tribal language, Ojibwe, to record, transcribe, translate, and help get their words out there. And so I've been thinking about, like, the characters in the book include, Ezra, who I mentioned, a teenage boy, and also his grandfather, one of the other really strong characters in the book, who's hilarious and a great window into our culture. And for me, it was the chance to grapple with those things. Also, I although I have been telling stories my whole life, that is both in our ceremonies, winter legends. I published many other books, and you're still telling stories, but with fiction, it's a whole different game. And I think some people don't make the transition from nonfiction to fiction very well, but I'm super excited about my efforts here because I knew what it was like to have a book where I was, assigned in class when I was going to school, where I was thinking, please, dear God, get me out of this room and away from this book as soon as possible. And
Yeah.
I knew what it was like to have something so engrossing that I had to stick it in the middle of the textbook and be secretly reading, the literature. And I wanted that. So I decided to test this out on my own children, who will definitely be my harshest critics. And I figured if they just start picking up their own, smartphones, or walk out of the room, I know it flopped. But I started reading it out loud to them, and they were really engrossed. So they were like, what's going to happen next? Do you think Nora and Ezra are going to get together? Who did it? So that for me was like one of the best barometers for the success of the work.
Oh yeah. I mean, how many people have access to that? Like the actual audience that you want to read and love the book, I mean, the thing about this industry is that we can get input from reviewers and from trade journals and stuff, and they know what they're talking about in terms of whether the kids are going to actually like the book. But to a certain extent, you don't actually know whether the kids are reading it and loving it unless you get a chance to actually talk to them. So it's so valuable to have that input.
Right. Like, of course, we try to cultivate all of the professional things, the reviews and the connections and the networking. But the single powerful barometer for the success of a book is just word of mouth. Are kids actually reading it? Are they excited about it? Are they talking to their parents and teachers about it? Does it inspire discussion? And, so far, so great. But, it's new, just dropped. So we'll know more as a few more weeks go by.
Well, to your point about your kids, I was really struck by, I mean, as someone who's not that far past teenagerhood, by the like way that you use like Gen Z language in like a way that is so perfect, because it's not overdone. And it's not in that way where, sometimes you'll have an adult writing a book that feels like it's really trying too hard to capture the way that the youths talk, and it gets like cringy. But there's just great little subtle moments. I mean, I just remember an early line that made me laugh out loud was like, sitting at a desk was not my love language. It just like for my so it killed me. So did you pick all that up from your kids as well?
Yeah, I'm living in teenager talk all the time. And so so it wasn't like I had to use the Gen Z translator app or something like that.
Then thank God, because that would probably have been wonky results. Yeah.
There is actually such a thing, and I have opened it up just to raise Cain with my own children, but it's not accurate.
Did you have any scenarios where you like had them read over like a specific scene or dialogue or whatever to read for authenticity in that regard?
Yes, so my youngest ones, who are 12, 14, and 16, we went through the whole book together. And then I have one of my college kids, I read it out loud to him while I was making him drive me off to a book event on a long trip. And so he also had some good feedback about different things. So I certainly took it all to heart.
Great. Are there any like specific lines that you can remember being a result of one of your kids editing them?
My son Elias was giving me commentary about like Instagram not Instagram, but TikTok, because Ezra's always scrolling TikTok, which by the way, I'm always doing too. He said, he was just, saying, hey, instead of like scrolling my feed, just scrolling TikTok or whatever. And so he offers some language, suggestions and things like that. But
Totally. Well, what about, okay, so you said before that fiction is a totally different game from like oral storytelling. I'm curious sort of what you meant by that, and sort of branching off of that, what are some of your literary influences, either in adult or young adult or children's?
Yeah, a really great story will have memorable characters who are shifting, changing, and transforming. For me, something that was beautiful about Game of Thrones or, Breaking Bad or, shows like that and literature like that was not just thick description and so forth, but you have characters who are on a trajectory, either for better or worse, where they are shifting and changing, and you are so bonded to them, you're along for the ride. And if you have a character who's like the good guy, who stays the good guy, always does the right things, and wins in the end, it's like, whatever, a John Wayne movie, it's not that exciting. But I think when we can see the imperfections, the struggles, the vulnerabilities, and there's an arc for each of the major characters, and then there's a plot line that is full of, crackling with tension, where you stay with the story. You're not just swimming in details or feelings, but it's taking you somewhere. So I wanted to construct that, but I also wanted it to be from the heart and very authentic. So the book is set in a couple of places: Northeast Minneapolis, the Nigigusa-Minneconning First Nation, and then out in the Canadian wilderness. And these are all places where I've spent a lot of time. So I didn't have to think about imagining those places. I, developed an arc for the characters and the plot, and was able to speak to these sorts of experiences. Even something like Ezra goes through this really powerful ceremony, first harvest celebration ceremony. And that's something that I went through as a young person, and all of my children have been through as they have been harvesters. So I didn't, again, have to imagine that. I could speak to our lived experience. And I do think that's something different about this work, is that it's not an imagining of the Native experience. It's not the white man's Indian. It is a window into an authentic Native universe.
Right. Oh yeah, absolutely. And as far as literary influences go, are there?
I read everything. I read at least 50 books a year, and some of that is standard way, just with hard copies, and sometimes I do a lot of Audible too when I'm traveling. But I go through a lot of books. I have read just about every genre and found things I have loved everywhere. So when you're reading this one, I was actually friends with Jim Paulson. That's the son of Gary Paulson, and spent time with him. He wrote a number of books that I thought did a great job of, kind of like Hatchet, especially, transporting you into the wilderness. So that was an influence. I love the Harry Potter books. I love Game of Thrones. I thought, for Game of Thrones, the thick description where you actually feel cold while he's writing it, like that was really impactful. And the way that he successfully transports you into a scene, and you can see character evolution within those, was great. I thought the plotting in Harry Potter was really brilliantly done. So there are many different influences for the things I've done, and I've read lots of Native lit. I adore Louise Erdrich. Her early work tracks. Have a couple of elder characters that probably had some influence in my development of Grandpa Liam in the work. So there are bits and pieces of everything, and bits and pieces of my own experience, although it's, I suppose, unique unto itself too.
Absolutely. And I was actually going to ask about the constructing of the nature sequences, so that answers that in terms of well, one thing that I'm curious about is, you said at the beginning, and we do pitch it this way as well, that it's kind of a lot of things, this book. It's a coming of age story, it's a thriller, it's a wilderness adventure. How did you go about balancing those things? Like, was it ever a challenge, or did you just know from the beginning what the sort of plot mode it was going to be in was, or did it shift over time? Like, did it start out as one thing and kind of evolve into another thing? What was that like?
No, I had to make some decisions along the way. I even had some things I held back on putting into the book. I was going to have a long storm sequence and different things like that, and I felt like I needed to keep the tension crackling along. So some things I had to trim down or exclude. And then, my revisions were pretty substantial on the work. So even from what I first read to my kids, I could tell what was working. But then they had some questions about other things that I thought, I've got to make sure that I answer this well. So even the treatment of Ezra's mother was quite different in the first writing, and I made significant changes to that, just to make sure that it was smooth.
Yeah. Are you willing to share like what kinds of changes or?
Well, in the book, Ezra's mother has passed away prior to the start of the book.
Right.
And he's grappling with loss. But initially, I had that, kind of evolving through the work. And it ended up being too busy. And so in some ways, this made it easier to focus on the two major things we were trying to do, which is the thriller dimension for the plot line and the transformation of Ezra from boy to man, so that those could be, centered, undistracted, and progress, for keeping tension. So those are kind of narrative decisions that I had to wrestle with a little bit. And there's always room for those things to pop up in other ways. So.
Oh, totally. And I think, I definitely think it reads that way. Like it's very, very focused. There's a lot packed into its, sort of tight pacing, but in a very effective way, I think. Quickly to circle back to, I realized that there was something I did not address about literary influences, which is just that obviously there are books mentioned in Werewolves Don't Die. When Ezra's packing up books to leave, he packs Attack on Titan, a Percy Jackson book, Chalice of the Gods, and the Firekeeper's Daughter. And how did you decide what Ezra's literary taste was going to be, or his music taste, or what kinds of things he watches on TV? Like, was that just based on stuff you enjoy, or was there were you trying to characterize him in any way?
It was a bit of both. I love Firekeeper's Daughter.
Of course.
And then, Game of Thrones and things like that were in there. But I have a 16-year-old son who loved Attack on Titan and, Naruto and different things like that. And so, I was kind of watching what was getting him engrossed too. And, as I'm sculpting Ezra's stuff.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Love that. Was there anything about the experience of writing for young adults that surprised you? This is also sort of a question about everything Indians, just because, that's a young reader's edition. And there is what to you does it mean to write for young people as opposed to write for adults?
Oh, I do think it's a little different. Obviously young adult works include some of the best-selling books of all time, and everybody's reading them, not just young people. But, I do think that young people think some different things and think about them differently. I'm old enough to have perspective on different chapters in my life, but I'm young enough to still remember the young stuff. And I, having been partner to my own children as they are currently going through all of these transformations and dealing with, anger and the necessary break from your parents. All kids have to break from their parents. Sometimes it is, I'm going to go off to college in a totally different place. Sometimes it's, I'm going to pick a totally different career than anyone in my family. Sometimes it's a big fight with the parents. It could be any number of things. That is normal and natural. But at the same time, I think all humans are also wrestling with freedom versus connection and belonging. Sometimes we sacrifice some freedoms to engineer more connection and belonging. Certainly that's what happens if you enter a monogamous relationship or something like that. But it's with all things. It's how free do I want to be from community, and how tethered do I want to be, knowing there are trade-offs both ways, being alone and adrift in the world versus, being tethered to a place, but being connected and supported and loved versus being alone. All these kinds of things are positives about every walk of life and every experience. And I think all of us wrestle with them. And those things are especially profound for young people who are kind of being forced, even though it's a little arbitrary to say 18 is, when you got to make all these big decisions or whatever. And it's different for different people. it's great fodder for literature.
Oh, absolutely. Is that something that you like went into the book knowing that you wanted to explore, or something that kind of emerged as like what was the what were your goals going in?
Oh yes. So I mentioned a little bit, like I'd like to turn
Yeah.
Native Lit on its head instead of focusing on trauma and tragedy, talk about living culture. But there's another major thing I was trying to do. I think over the past couple of decades, getting better broadly within literature at holding up more female authors, more representation from various gender identities. This is all emerging work. It's by no means complete, but it's very heartening and exciting to see. A press like Levine Querido has been really, really a powerful partner in holding up a lot of those voices. And it's just really noble work. And I think we've also been getting a little bit better at identifying like toxic masculinity and the problems with that and some of the struggles, that are associated with it. But something we have not done very well, and certainly not enough of, is just provide examples of healthy masculinity. What would it look like for a teenage boy becoming a man to experience that in his own authentic cultural context that helps him wrestle with the things that all of us humans wrestle with, including loss, connection, freedom, anger, all the
Yeah.
things. Arrive at a place of healing.
Yeah.
And, I do think that is something that this work addresses. I think it's one of the most powerful parts of it. I'm hopeful for what that can convey to young people, for everybody. Because it's one thing to unpack everything wrong in our world, but if you don't show people something different or better, how do we grow and heal and reconcile? And so I'm hopeful that it will answer something there. I think some of the like stuff that was coming out like in the 1970s was, hitting on the empathy thing, but it's more like, I feel sorry for those poor people. Let me go hug a native after I read this book. And I'm hoping that this will be more like people looking in the mirror and saying, who am I? And maybe want to go hug their own family members or things like that, that it will evoke rather than prescribe.
That that all really, really comes through. I was just thinking about the Ezra's relationship with his emotions and some of the metaphors that he uses to describe it. There was this really potent one about his emotions being a dark cloud that he and his dad were speaking through, but not addressing. And I just feel like a lot of that is very like, particularly since you have these masculine relationships between him and his dad and between him and his grandpa, as like very, very central. And that's obviously a huge part of it, right? It's not necessarily something we see represented a lot in YA, is like these kind of intergenerational relationships.
Right.
Just,
and I think we've also been getting a little bit better at identifying like toxic masculinity and the problems with that and some of the struggles, that are associated with it. But something we have not done very well, and certainly not enough of, is just provide examples of healthy masculinity. What would it look like for a teenage boy becoming a man to experience that in his own authentic cultural context that helps him wrestle with the things that all of us humans wrestle with, including loss, connection, freedom, anger, all the things. Arrive at a place of healing.
Yeah.
And, I do think that is something that this work addresses. I think it's one of the most powerful parts of it. I'm hopeful for what that can convey to young people, for everybody. Because it's one thing to unpack everything wrong in our world, but if you don't show people something different or better, how do we grow and heal and reconcile? And so I'm hopeful that it will answer something there. I think some of the like stuff that was coming out like in the 1970s was, you know, hitting on the empathy thing, but it's more like, I feel sorry for those poor people. Let me go hug a native after I read this book. And I'm hoping that this will be more like people looking in the mirror and saying, who am I? You know, and maybe want to go hug their own family members or things like that, that it will evoke rather than prescribe.
That, I mean, that all really, really comes through. I was just thinking about the Ezra's relationship with his emotions and some of the metaphors that he uses to describe it. There was this this really potent one about his emotions being a dark cloud that he and his dad were speaking through, but not addressing. And I just feel like a lot of that is very, like, particularly since you have these masculine relationships between him and his dad and between him and his grandpa as like very, very central. And I mean, that's obviously a huge part of it, right? It's not necessarily something we see represented a lot in YA, is like these kind of intergenerational relationships.
Right.
It's just, for whatever reason, it's just not like there's just not that many grandparent characters or that many supportive fathers or you know, fathers who are really trying their best.
Right.
Yeah, that was really
yeah.
I mean, I think that's needed. We're getting that feedback too, you know, from people that read. Yeah,
that's really great. Yeah, and I think, you know, the major teenage characters in the work, so it's Ezra, Nora, and Matt, have each had a loss.
Yeah.
And have each metabolized it in different ways with very different results. And so, again, without prescribing it, you know, readers can see what happens down different paths. And hopefully it'll say something that really connects for young people.
Yeah. Well, actually, I mean, I didn't have it down to talk about Matt, but I'm curious about what that sort of characterization and character process was like. I mean, building an antagonist is such an interesting, like, you do a great job of making him genuinely an antagonist and also a teenager, you know, at the same time. And I'm just curious what that was like.
Yeah. And I mean, this is the kind of thing, if we're going to do a multi-book series, you know, you can come from a totally different perspective on things. Because I think there's much more to say about Matt, even than what I did. But yes, you know, a very protagonist, but, you know, Nora's been dealing with a loss that happened earlier in her life, and is able to provide perspective from a distance. Matt, in a very different way, is kind of acting out from his. And there are points when, like, either Nora is pointing this out to Ezra or he starts to see it for himself, that in many ways Matt, as awful as he has been to Ezra, is acting from a place of pain and loss. That he actually is not only experiencing a loss, but he, you know, has to deal with being dislocated out of his home community, and he's got to find his way, you know. And so it invites a level of empathy, I think, even though he's still, you know, terrorizes, you know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's basically what I was asking about, is the process of building that, because that's a really tough balance to strike. So that's very cool, the way that you did that. Okay, I just have a couple more questions. One, I mean, obviously, you're a professor of Ojibwe, and so is the dad.
Yeah.
Is that like, was there? I'm curious about that decision, just in terms of like Ezra's, you know, obviously shifting and complex relationship with his dad's job and his sort of, you know, like an annoyed stance about all of it at the beginning, and the way that develops as the story goes. Like, just what was that like, since that actually is your job?
Yeah. So yeah, where did that come from? I you know, it provided a way to think about something else that is going on in the Native experience. So, you know, 50% of our enrolled tribal citizens live off reservation. 70% of the self-identified native population lives off reservation. So the native experience is not just a reservation experience. It is urban, it is suburban, it is reservation, it is all of the above. It's pretty common for someone, even if they are living in an urban area, to be going back and forth to their community of origin and things like that. And so I think some of the other work out there has been a little flat, where it's kind of one dimensional. It's only one thing. So, or it's like the urban native doesn't have culture because urban, you know, or the reservation person does because they live in their home community. And I think there are lots of native people who feel lost in all the places. And there are lots of people who are living a vibrant cultural life in all of the places and environments. And so, you know, I think, although, yes, the father has, you know, the same job that I do, at the same time, it just provides a window into thinking about what does it mean to be indigenous. So, you know, indigenous can mean, you know, of the land, or from a connection to a certain place. So at one point in time, all of us were indigenous to somewhere. And because Ezra spent some time in Northeast on the res, and then out in the wilderness, and, you know, back to the family, you know, space, you know, at each of those, he's having a different indigenous experience, a different authentic indigenous experience. And so he's wrestling with, what does it mean, you know, to find home? And of course, that's something that's spoken to in the book too.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Kind of switching gears here, but I did want to ask about your writing process. And by that, I actually just mean like logistically, like what do you do to get in the zone? What time of day do you write? How do you make time for it with like, you obviously like never sleep because you have a million things going on. Like, how do you do it?
Yeah, I am not one of those like get up at 5 and write for 2 hours before life begins. In fact, I'm probably quite ADHD in my approach to everything. Like I literally do get lost in my TikTok feed. I easily distracted. I can turn on the like hyper focus thing. And so I write kind of opportunistically, usually in bigger, rather than as like a consistent disciplined practice. That's me. Not necessarily recommending that for anyone else. I think a strengths-based approach will serve best. So if somebody thrives well with the disciplined approach, go for it. And if somebody wants to do it a different way, that's fine. But I will say this, you know, I do think about it all the time. And I take, you know, I'm kind of an outgoing introvert, so I charge my battery away from humans. And then once I'm charged up, I do love people and so forth. And I'm not usually super shy, but I need to make that time for myself. So when I'm going for a long run, or even if I'm going for a long drive, I am thinking about all the things. And so by the time I sit down to do the writing part, most of the work is done.
Yeah, no, that's so true, because a lot of it is mulling it over and thinking about it. And oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm just personally very impressed that you wrote such a stunning book in that kind of mode, because I can often get in that mode in my own life too, and it's like hard to get anything done. So I'm amazed. It worked for you is all I'm saying.
Yeah.
Well, okay. To conclude, I was hoping you could provide some book recommendations for anyone watching. Like if they liked your book, what might they like, or just, you know, what are you enjoying right now?
Oh yeah. So there are lots of books I could point people to. If you liked, you know, the elder characters and things like that, I could recommend Louise Erdrich's work, Tracks. It was one of her early works. It wasn't even her best-selling work, but it remains my favorite book of hers. I think, yeah, the characters are just so alive in there. If you like, you know, the murder mystery and tension stuff, Angeline Boulley's work, especially Firekeeper's Daughter, but also Warrior Girl on Earth have been really great. The Marrow Thieves, you know, is also interesting, thinking not just about a modern, but a post-apocalyptic, you know, native space with strong native characters has been great. Interested in a deeper dive on like the residential boarding schools and things like that. Indian Horse by Richard Waghama. It's a little heavy, but it is a powerful book. And there are just so many other works that I, you know, would speak to. And, you know, I read everything from self-help books to, you know, young adult to made for everybody fiction, to, you know, everything in between, history works too. So I think there are benefits to all of those, but that's some of what comes to mind.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Anton. I'm just going to hold up the book again so everyone can see it. This is Where Wolves Don't Die by Anton Treuer. It is out everywhere, so please pick up a copy if this conversation was interesting to you, which it certainly was because Anton had great answers. Thank you so much, Anton. Really appreciate your time today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Have a great rest of your gorgeous day in Minnesota. I'm so jealous.
You too. Thanks.
Miigwech for watching today. I'm Anton Treuer.